Good evening. I'm Richard Lane, and it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Antonio Damasio for his keynote lecture on sensing minds and consciousness. He is University Professor, David Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience, Professor of Psychology, Professor of Philosophy, and Director of the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. He's also an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. Starting with his detailed knowledge of the brain as a clinical neurologist and neuroscientist, Professor Damasio addresses some of the most important questions pertaining to what it means to be human, emotions and feelings, the sense of self, and consciousness. He does so by integrating and interweaving neuroscience with historically rich discussions of philosophy, psychology, cultural and intellectual history, and the evolution of life on Earth. He concludes that feelings are essential to all that matters to us: art, music, philosophy, science, culture, friendship, and love. Without feelings, complex life would not aim to sustain itself. I personally found his first book in 1994, Descartes' Error, to be particularly inspiring and influential for my own work on emotional awareness, because he so persuasively argued that emotional feelings, including somatic markers, have a purpose and neuroanatomy of their own and are not mere epiphenomena that happen to accompany affective responses. Moreover, a foundational thesis is that automatic emotional responses and the subjective experience of those responses, called feelings, are not one and the same. It's remarkable that someone who has written 5 best-selling books also has a research track record that makes him one of the most elite and influential scientists on the planet. He has received continuous federal funding for his research for 30 years. He has a staggering H-index of 144, which means 144 papers that have each been cited at least 144 times, and over 129,000 citations. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, and has received a series of other prestigious awards and honorary doctorates that are far too numerous to mention here, but are all richly deserved. In short, I think we're in for a real treat. But stature aside, Professor Damasio has a unique perspective on the essential role of emotion and feeling in consciousness that I believe is important for everyone at this conference to understand and appreciate. So please join me in warmly welcoming Antonio Damasio.
Thank you. Richard, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Richard and I are old comrades in arms in the work, with our work on the neurology of affect. So it's a great pleasure to have you introducing me today. I would like, before I start, to acknowledge 2 colleagues with whom I debate many of the subjects that we're going to approach today, and they are Kingston Mann and Hartmut Neven, and it's always a great pleasure to argue with them about these issues. And I also like to thank Stuart Emmeroff for bringing me back to Tucson, in a manner of speaking. I've always enjoyed coming to the conference, and I think that Tucson, the conference, is a testimony to the importance of consciousness, to the importance of this topic as a biological phenomenon, and the merit for that acknowledgement is clearly Stuart's. He invented the conference and he made it the success it is anywhere in the world. So I would like to, let me say that I've been doing a lot of lectures on Zoom. I have my troubles with the technology, and I think the troubles are worse if you do PowerPoint. So I decided no slides, I'm just going to talk from notes. So if you bear with me, we will get there. So I would like to begin by posing a number of questions. And the first question, since I talked about the importance of consciousness, is why is consciousness an important topic, humanly and scientifically? And the answer, I would say, is because it allows creatures, not just humans, but other creatures that are conscious, to respond in a way that has real or presumed autonomy, rather than in an automated, non-deliberated manner. And when these deliberate responses are informed by knowledge, specifically by recent updated knowledge, there are consequences for the living creature in question. This conscious, knowledgeable, deliberate response can bring about, can avert dangers, can help avert dangers, and can actually improve the responses, and can even lead to a creative response. So in other words, consciousness is useful, and that's probably the first thing I want to leave very clear, is that I don't think that consciousness is anything that we can do without, or if we do without, we, as Stuart Hameroff, who is an expert on anesthesia, knows very well, if we do without, we're not going to do much. So this is important stuff, and that's why it deserves our attention. Investigating mechanisms of consciousness are important, and I would start by asking, how can we define this phenomenon that we want to study, this consciousness, and how can we study it? And for me, the question or the approach really begins with introspection. Now, some of you may wonder, well, introspection, is that a very old-fashioned thing? Is that 19th century neurology and psychiatry? And my answer is no. Of course, there was plenty of introspection going on in the hands of and minds of wonderful scientists of the time. But the fact is that this is our possibility of inspecting directly the mind, the mental scene, analyzing it, and analyzing it in a very sophisticated way. You can have light introspection, or introspection that focuses in a very informed way about the phenomena that we are trying to understand. And there's something more that is important within this, by the way, different from what was possible, say, in the 19th century, is that now we have a whole corpus of sciences that we can connect with the introspective material that we get. So if I analyze my mind, and if I have experimental questions in my mind about what is it like to be conscious and to have a mind, I can bring to bear on the answers all the sciences that in the meantime have emerged since introspection was first practiced, and connect my findings, my mental findings, with general biology, with chemistry, with physics, with psychology, with neuroscience. And then we've got something very rich. We don't just have a series of internal observations, which are of course mandatory, because this is an internal phenomenon that is not available to others, but we can connect what we find with all these sciences and make lead to generating interesting hypotheses that then we can test in a variety of ways, including, of course, the formal laboratory way. What has this informed introspection taught me over the years, and especially recently as I've been pondering some of these questions? And what it has taught me is that mind is a flowing mental process, and it is a mental process that is connected, that is made of connected image patterns. And I'm insisting here on some of these terms that can have different meanings, but I'm trying to make them clear. When I talk about image, I'm not talking about visual images only. I'm talking about images that are that can come from vision, or from hearing, or from touching. There's several modalities that can inform the making of an image. And I'm saying that there is a pattern. So what defines image, and that's why I prefer to use the term imagetic pattern, is the fact that there is an extension to that particular process. There's a spatiality to it, there are metrics to it. So it is not the same thing as, for example, my touching a bacterium under the microscope and realizing that the bacterium, for example, contracts its body or removes its body to a different position. And the difference here is very, very important, is that in the case of the typical imagetic patterns, you have something that you can actually inspect with the rest of your mind, and you have a process that is interposed between the stimulus and the response, a process which, by the way, can lead to complete reasoning and to the arriving at a particular conclusion. Whereas what you find when you have this bacterium that I told you about, you have the bacterium responding to something that it sensed. There is no possibility.
Is it being recorded?
Yeah, it's being recorded.
Is there any problem?
I mean, if we can restart it if you want, or you can keep going and we can add people in there.
Can you explain what the problem is?
Sure. Can you hear us?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear us?
Sorry,
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry to interrupt. So the platform that streams has completely gone down, so we have no audience. We have two options. One, we can keep recording and then put this up later, or I guess we could join the audience through Zoom. Is that the other option?
Yeah, that would be the only.
Well, why not do it that way?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The only
I'll just
problem
let
is
you
not
know.
everyone might not have Zoom installed, but
I see what you're
That's
saying.
this is just like you open up a web page. See both of you guys, but Zoom
So when did the website go down?
just now.
5 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago.
What more?
So I think
Yeah.
probably getting people to join on Zoom is the best, because then it'll be live.
Well, but then what would we do? Do we start again with Richard's introduction, or what? Were people there at the beginning of the talk or not?
Were people there at the beginning?
Well, they're in this right now, and you're seeing what they're saying. So yeah.
Yeah, not clear, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like the whole platform has gone down. Did they get DOX'd or?
I don't know. It's I checked the only thing that might be wrong, and it's correct. So
Well, we can blame the Russians for this.
Well, I don't, if you want, listen, I don't think it makes any sense for me to continue if people miss the beginning.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
send them all the Zoom invite link, and then they can join.
Okay, and what about the conference schedule? I mean, can we take the hour?
Yeah.
Is there anything happening?
I mean,
Antonio,
Abby,
do you
wanna
have
make
the time?
executive?
I can do it. I can do it.
Yeah, I think as long as you end by 6:10, you'll be okay.
6:10.
Yeah, you're only losing 5 minutes.
150 that are late. Are you okay if we restart, Dr. Damasio?
That's perfectly fine. I can restart. Why don't we have Richard do his introduction, and then I'll start, and I will go as quickly as possible.
All right.
We'll send out
Thank
the
you so
Zoom
much.
link, and then
And so when would people see this? If
We're
they would.
on the Zoom link now, so we'll try to get everybody joined. So we'll
Okay.
probably start in about 2-3 minutes.
yeah. I'll
Okay,
send
so
it.
you're not going to do the video again, right?
No.
Not the video. But now you have practice at least for the beginning.
I suggest you don't do the video.
I'm letting them all know right now.
I'm so glad we don't have slides.
It was very smart.
So the whole platform for the conference is down.
Just the video part. So there's something
What
about
else
there.
is
Well, the web page is still there, but the streaming part of the website is down for some reason.
And so you're sending a message to everybody who's,
He's in the room.
Who's waiting?
He's waiting.
okay, that's 150.
Yeah.
I see.
All joining
How many
right
people?
now. They're saying, so get ready.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Start again.
You'll see
So
them
do they
all.
know what's going on?
Yeah, they know.
Yeah. So,
They were talking about FOMO, fear of missing out. So I think they're all anticipating something coming on soon.
Okay, and we can go.
Why was this? Was it hacked or?
What's happening at 6:10?
well, at 6:30, we're starting another session. So
Oh,
we're
well,
just
we can
getting-
go over.
Yeah, you can go a little bit over.
We'll go over. Take as much
Let's
time.
take a full hour.
Yeah, take the hour at least.
Okay. So when do I start?
They'll let us know.
They're joining right now. You got 19 joining, 20, 21.
Start.
If you want. They're still floating in. We can.
How many are there now?
There's 30. So you got 10 in the last 10 seconds.
Why don't we show the video?
Let's wait another minute and let people get in.
So
Yeah, you can run the video for 2 minutes. We're starting over. We have a whole hour. Go ahead.
All right.
I'm sorry about this. It's been working fine the whole time. Yeah, go ahead and send an announcement.
Okay.
The link is in the chat.
Wait, there were
The
125.
link is in the chat.
The chat of the, I'll put it in the Q&A.
All right. Let's skip the video and I'll just start. Okay?
All right.
The link is in the chat.
How many people are there now?
The link is in the
40. Yeah.
40.
Good.
Okay. So hi everybody, we're gonna start over. Sorry about these technical difficulties, but let me welcome you. I'm Richard Lane, and it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Antonio Damasio introduce him again, for his keynote lecture on sensing minds and consciousness. He is University Professor David Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience, Professor of Psychology, Professor of Philosophy, and Director of the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. He is also an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. Starting with his detailed knowledge of the brain as a clinical neurologist and neuroscientist, Professor Damasio addresses some of the most important questions pertaining to what it means to be human: emotions and feelings, the sense of self, and consciousness. He does so by integrating and interweaving neuroscience with historically rich discussions of philosophy, psychology, cultural and intellectual history, and the evolution of life on Earth. He concludes that feelings are essential to all that matters to us: art, music, philosophy, science, culture, friendship, and love. Without feelings, complex life would not aim to sustain itself. I personally found his first book in 1994, Descartes' Error, to be particularly inspiring and influential for my own work on emotional awareness, because he so persuasively argued that emotional feelings, including somatic markers, have a purpose and neuroanatomy of their own and are not mere epiphenomena that happen to accompany affective responses. Moreover, a foundational thesis is that automatic emotional responses and the subjective experience of those responses, called feelings, are not one and the same. It's remarkable that someone who has written 5 best-selling books also has a research track record that makes him one of the most elite and influential scientists on the planet. He's received continuous federal funding for his research for 30 years. He has a staggering H-index of 144, which means 144 papers that have each been cited at least 144 times, and over 129,000 citations. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, and has received a series of other prestigious awards and honorary doctorates that are far too numerous to mention here, but are all richly deserved. In short, I think we're in for a real treat. But stature aside, Professor Damasio has a unique perspective on the essential role of emotion and feeling and consciousness that I believe is important for everyone at this conference to understand and appreciate. So please join me in warmly welcoming Antonio Damasio.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for your kind introduction. Richard Lane and I go way back. We're both comrades in arms in our search for the neurology of affect. And I'm delighted. Thank you very much for being here for the introduction. And I would also like to thank and acknowledge Stuart Hameroff for bringing me back to Tucson, in a manner of speaking. Tucson, this conference, is a testimony, of course, to the importance of consciousness as a biological phenomenon. And the reason why we have that available is in part through Stuart's effort. He has invented this conference and he has made it the success it is. So let me begin by, let me say that I'm not going to have slides. As you know, these technologies are bad enough, as we can just verified. But I think they're even worse when we have slides and PowerPoint to contend with. So I have notes, and I will refer to my notes and talk to you directly. So there is this question, which is, why is it that consciousness is an important topic humanly and scientifically? And I think this has a very pointed answer, and that is because consciousness allows creatures to act with real or presumed autonomy rather than in a pure automated, non-deliberate manner. And I think that that transition from what is automated to what is deliberated is key to the role of consciousness. It is consciousness that permits us to do that. And of course, when consciousness is informed by knowledge, specifically fresh knowledge, it turns out that consciousness is extremely important and has enormous consequences for the living and for conscious organisms. And this is, of course, extremely useful for those organisms. So this sort of brings into focus one problem that every once in a while is approached, which is the question, is consciousness even useful? Is consciousness of any use to human beings? And the answer is it definitely is. It follows that investigating the mechanisms that allow us to generate consciousness are obviously also an important matter. So let's try to provide some definition of consciousness, this thing that we want to study and understand, and begin by saying a word about the methods that we can use to go into it. After all, consciousness is not something you see on the outside of a body. It's not a paralysis that you can investigate or a disturbance of language that you can also investigate, which have very objective manifestations that begin to tell you what it is and where it is from and what causes it. Consciousness is hidden. How can we study it? And my fundamental approach here is actually through something that may sound at first quite old-fashioned, but it is not, and that is through introspection. So introspection is this ability that we have to inspect and scrutinize our own minds. And it is quite remarkable, and quite frankly, there's no other way of getting into the issue of consciousness, our very consciousness, if we do not go through introspection first. What is also very interesting is that introspection has been, as a method of investigation of phenomena of the mind, has been enriched and completed by all the developments in the sciences that have been especially prominent over the past century. So what I inspect on my mind in an informed and technically as sophisticated way as I can then be connected with a variety of sciences that are also relevant from what we know about how minds connect with living bodies and with brains in them, can also be connected with sciences that have developed extraordinarily over time, such as general biology, chemistry, physics, psychology, neuroscience. So what we end up, you start in what appears to be an old-fashioned, but is in fact inevitable and mandatory way, and you end up connecting what you find in your introspective exploration with a variety of the most modern sciences that you can use, and you can, one hopes, produce some enlightenment at the end of this tunnel. So you may ask, what has introspection, informed introspection, told me about consciousness, and about all of this phenomenology in general? The first thing it has told me is that when I look inside, what I find is a mind, a mental process. And that mental process is really a flowing process that is made up of units that are well connected with each other, that flow rather naturally. And those units are images, or in my preferred nomenclature, imagetic patterns. In other words, they're things that you can really put your mental finger on, such as a visual image or an auditory image or a tactile image. And those images are patterns. They have a structure. There's something in it. There's an extension, there's a spatiality to it, there's something that is a metric, and you can even think about patterns that resemble or do not resemble other patterns. And I think it's very important that you realize this reality, because there's plenty of behavior by humans and by non-human creatures that does not have this base and does not have these characteristics. So for example, if you look at the behavior of bacteria, by far the oldest living organisms on Earth, we can push it back to 4 billion years ago. And when you look at these creatures, they have, of course, a body, they have a limit to that body, it's in the form of a membrane. And when there is a stimulus, when there is something that connects, touches, for example, or pokes one of these organisms sense that there was something that was done to them. I prefer actually the term detect. They detect it and they can generate a response. But the marvel here is that if you take a typical bacterium that does not even have a nucleus, let alone a brain, what it has is a series of biochemical processes within this physical unit. And these organisms have the possibility of response, have the possibility of that, giving that response to adjust themselves and the continuation of their life in some intelligent and useful way. There is an intelligence there. There is a primitive form of cognition, but, and I insist, there is nothing that resembles mind. What is happening there is this stimulus and response, and with this process, by the way, is something that we have as well. We can recognize and detect plenty of stimuli and respond to them without actually having any mental process in between the stimulus and the response. So the first thing that we need to agree on is that when we inspect our minds, we find this flowing mental process with imagetic patterns, and this is what really constitutes a mind. We also know that those patterns can be generated in a variety of ways. To begin with, they're generated out of perceptual processes. You look out into the world and you perceive things through one of your sensory channels, but interestingly, you can also make memories of those things that you perceive. And out of those memories, you can bring back a certain amount of that pattern so that you have in your mind, generally flowing in parallel, images that are perceptual in the proper sense, actually perceptual in that moment, and images that are coming from memory stores through processes of recall and restitution of the pattern, and those are the two main sources. You also then, something very important that I want to call attention to so that you get ready for some of the statements that I will make later, and that is that these patterns that you're generating are different when you're relating to stimuli that are out in the world around our organisms and to stimuli that are in your interior. And what is the difference here? Well, the difference is colossal, because there are things that are around in our surround, and there are things that are inside. Their movements, their actions, their entire objects within our organism, such as, for example, a certain set of viscera, or what a viscous is doing at a particular moment, and those are objects too. But the way the reality of the outside world and the reality of the inside world are being apprehended is remarkably different. Why is it different? Well, it actually has even different machinery from a neural standpoint. The machinery of our nervous system that picks up on the world outside is actually very, very sophisticated. For example, all its nerve fibers, or the majority of them, are myelinated. They're highly insulated, rapidly conducting fibers. It's really, a top-notch machine. When you look at the machinery that is looking at our interior, it's a completely different story. We actually find largely, easily 90% of the fibers that are used by our interoception are fibers that are not myelinated, that are quite leaky. They have membranes that are open to their local environment. We also find that, for example, the ganglia that bring information from the periphery of the organism to the central nervous system, such as the spinal ganglia, or for that matter, the trigeminal ganglion, are arranged in a different way with an enormous amount of permeability to the blood circulation, because they lack a blood-brain barrier, for example. So what you have is that you have a way of collecting information from the outside that is very sharp, very technologically advanced, better than Zoom, and you have on the other side a technology that is very, very old, and that goes back to the beginning of nervous systems, which, is not that old. We're talking about 500 million years, a pittance compared to 4 billion, but nonetheless, substantially established mechanisms. So what I wanted is to create that distinction between these two sources of information, because that is going to be helpful for me when I make some other comments about the process. So, as I said, introspection tells me what about consciousness itself as distinct from mind. It tells me that what consciousness consists of, that's my fundamental hypothesis, is an alteration or an enrichment of the basic process of mind. So you can have a process of flowing of patterns, imagetic patterns, in whatever sensory stripe you choose, and they would be there, but who would know that they're mine? Who would know that they belong to a particular organism, which happens to be my organism? Well, that is an enrichment, an addition of knowledge that is going to be placed on those patterns as they are occurring in time and flowing forward. And that addition of knowledge, that plus that is given, that is exactly what I think is the key to the process of consciousness. So this is a process that occurs within mind. It's not a process that I imagine as free floating around and being captured by some strange means. It is a process that is biological, that is occurring within your organism, and that is occurring within your mind. And it really is the way of making this transition from something that would not be claimed, would not be yours, and something that, lo and behold, now becomes mine. It belongs to my organism. Now, what is the physiology behind this? What's the status of these kinds of phenomena? And what I would say is that from a physiological, constitutional standpoint, consciousness is a biological phenomenon. And of course, so is mind. So you have a biological phenomenon that helps transform another biological phenomenon. And it is through that transition that you obtain what you call a conscious state. So very rapidly, just to agree on these following points. Mind and consciousness are both biological processes. The manifestations include a mental aspect, and those two things are not incompatible. You can have a mental aspect to the process, but the process is fundamentally biological. And I label the process biological when the origin of the process, the construction of the process, and its dominant nature have to do with biological systems such as we know them, living systems where cells reign supreme and where there are physicochemical processes that maintain those cells alive. And again, the mental is an aspect of the biological. Now, what are the mechanisms, if we can propose some, behind this transition, this trick where you go from a plain mind process, where you just have a long train of flowing imagetic patterns, to a special train of imagetic patterns where you know, suddenly you're informed that they belong to you, that they are yours. Okay, how do you achieve that? And the mechanism behind this major change of state for the mind process begins with the presence and involvement of feelings. And this is the key to my talk, actually. It's the notion that it is the feeling process that is the key to the generation of consciousness. And then, of course, if we're going to have some force behind this statement, we need to understand what feelings are. Well, feelings are, first of all, hybrid processes. And I'll tell you in a minute why they're hybrid. They are largely based on the body's interior, and they are physiologically the result of an interaction. So I've already told you several bits of information that are indispensable. First, that they're hybrid. They're mixed, they're mongrels. Second, that they correspond to phenomena of the interior. Feelings are translations of events that are happening in our physiology within the limits of our body. They don't correspond to what is happening outside. If I look out and look at a landscape, or if I look up and look at the lights that are lighting me at the moment. And then I said that they were the result of an interaction. Well, let's find out interaction of what with what. It's the interaction between a process that is homeostatically driven, life regulatory. So it's the process of regulating your life automatically, internally, without you having any say whatsoever in it to begin with. And of course, regulating your life according to your homeostatic dictates so that your life can be maintained. So there's an interaction between those life regulatory processes, which, by the way, have nothing to do with the brain. They are the processes that are occurring in any living thing, even if the living thing doesn't happen to have a brain, doesn't happen to have any nervous system. And the other point of the interaction is, and of course these processes are happening in our chemical and visceral interior, and something that I will call the Intraceptive Maps, which are generated at multiple levels of the nervous system, including the peripheral nervous system, for example, the nerves and the spinal ganglia, or the trigeminal ganglia in the brainstem, central nervous system nuclei, such as, for example, the parabrachial nucleus, and insular cortices and cingulate cortices. So you have, on the one side of this mixed process, you have a number of nervous structures. And those nervous structures, let me repeat, include peripheral nervous system structures such as ganglia, entry into spinal cord, brainstem nuclei, and then at the level of the cerebral cortex, a variety of regional cortices such as the insular cortices, the cingulate cortices, that are literally centers where information has been carried out from, or carried to, from the periphery, and which handle that information, and which can, of course, respond to the periphery. What is very important here is for you to realize something that we have to insist on. when I look out in the world and I register images of that world, I have, I can create a beautiful, complex, imagetic pattern. I can render it conscious if I add to it a number of processes, including feeling, but I have no way of interacting with that object at all. That object is out in the world somewhere, and even if I'm touching it, my nervous system has no possibility of interacting with that object, but certainly not my visual or my auditory system. It's completely different when we're talking about the things we feel. The things we feel are inside of our living organism. And because they are inside of our living organism, there is this possibility of the structures that I'm talking about, the things that are felt, interacting with the neural structures that are engaged in the feeling. So there is an interaction, there's a duality to the process that is remarkable. And what is just as remarkable is that this is normally not noted, and people don't pay attention to this. And there's this false idea that what I have in my extraception, what I'm looking out in the landscape, is the same thing as my looking out at my stomach, or looking out at my gut, or looking out at the way I'm breathing right now. And it is not. I'm not interacting with the landscape, but I am interacting, or that is, my nervous system is interacting directly with the landscape that it is mapping. And that is, by the way, why many of you will have heard of things such as gating your pain. Why is it that you can have pain and under certain circumstances be able to actually reduce pain if there is a psychological phenomenon that allows you to lead to the spritzing of a number of neurochemical substances that will alleviate that pain and make it reducible. There's no comparison between that and what exists outside of your nervous system, or your organism, I'm sorry. So this intraceptive component that generates feelings and that give this enormous power to the process of consciousness, because it allows the things that we perceive, the things that we think, the things that we recall, to be connected with our organism and with only our organism, are further enhanced by a variety of things that our nervous system does, and they're all useful and important. One is proprioceptive signaling. So we have, of course, when we are infants and children, our body changes gradually until it reaches a mature age. And throughout this process of maturation, and certainly by the time you reach you reach mature age, you have constructed a musculoskeletal frame that then remains fairly stable through the rest of your life. And that musculoskeletal frame, muscles, striated muscles, and bones, provide a frame for your organism and provide a reference point for things that occur in the mind of your organism. And in addition, to complete the processes that feed into our consciousness, we have a variety of memorized material that has come from our past experience, and we have the possibility of reasoning about over the things that we are perceiving at a given moment. So all of this provides both a neural and organismic structure for the process of building consciousness, and of course that can be enriched with these devices that I just mentioned, such as proprioception and the use of reasoning and extraceptive signaling. So what I would say, to summarize this part, is to say that conscious mental states provide what I would call a revelation, in the proper sense of the term, to the respective mind process, that mind belongs and is located within the very same organism presently engaged in living and thinking. So if you did not have that revelation, you would have no way of connecting what is going on in your mind, rich as it may be, with the fact that you're here in a certain point and now, and that organism and that mind are together. It is that consciousness gives us. Consciousness gives us the possibility of owning our mind and body in their togetherness. And so that information, that revelation, is firstly and automatically accomplished via feeling. It is feeling that gives you, even if feeling wouldn't want to give it to you, it would give it to you because it's giving you that connection that is indelible between something that causes that feeling and the fact that it's a picture, a very rich, multifarious picture of your internal world. And I think the fact that these feelings are atypical processes and they're not just like a regular perception is a key to understanding a lot of the problems that unfortunately dominate and sort of stop solutions in the field of consciousness. For example, the idea that it is impossible to explain how a physical object like the brain generates consciousness. My answer to the way that problem is generally posed is very simple. Nobody asks you to. It is nobody is asking the brain to do consciousness alone, and guess what? It doesn't. The brain is a very important partner in the production of what we call conscious states because it interacts with a living organism that brain serves to regulate and helps regulate. But there is an interaction between the two, and the interaction is epitomized by this duality and this interrelationship between what is body and what is nervous system at the level of intraception. Let me summarize, since we're probably getting late, summarize the situation and make a number of comments about what I've said. First, I've talked about a simple process that is available in creatures without nervous systems, which you can call sensing or detecting and responding. And this is something that is available throughout the living nature, and is, by the way, available as well in plants. This is not something that is restricted to animalia. Then I talked about a process of minding, a process where you generate patterns with a certain structure, a certain speciality, and where you have this imagetic profusion that allows you to enrich your conception of the world, not only the world outside, but the world inside. Then the fact that you have, and there, by the way, the fact that the representations of the world outside have in many cases something that will be the telltale, which is a resemblance to that world outside, which you can actually adjudicate over. That is extremely important. And that's, of course, a source of memory as well. Then you have the process of feeling, which I just described, and which I think is key when we're going to discuss consciousness. And of course, it's key also to anything that is of great interest in the world of humanity, and not only, because you cannot talk about creativity, you cannot talk about normal human behavior without factoring in everything that comes via feeling. And then you have the process of being conscious, which is this identification of the organism as the structure that is connected with the mind, and that allows you to have the two working in tandem. Let me add that I would like to make a brief comment on an issue that I know is very interesting and important to Stuart Hameroff and to his colleagues and to some of my colleagues, and that is the whole world of quantum phenomena. Well, I think this is very, I didn't particularly mention this. This is not my primary field. And when I have colleagues like Hartmut Neven that are specialists on that, I don't want to sing out of tune. But I see the importance of these phenomena, not at the level of consciousness as I described it, because I think I can cope with the problem of consciousness at systems level. But I think it is absolutely critical when we are discussing what I would call the fabric of mind, when we are discussing the texture that corresponds to the mind process. So to understand how those images that I value so much when I describe them in relation to the outside world or in relation to feelings and the inside world, there I think the quantum phenomena are going to be extremely important to generate explanations that will be as rich as we need to have them be for this to make any sense. But I don't think that they are necessary for me to explain what is going on at the level of this transition between a mental pattern plane and a mental pattern that has now been enriched by feeling knowledge of its own status in relation to a certain organism. I think that can be achieved at the level of systems with the kinds of structures that I just outlined for you. And I think that I probably could stop right now. I know that we have a lot of difficulties with the technical difficulties, and I have lost track of where I am in the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We actually have a full hour and we have roughly 25 minutes left for discussion. So I want to encourage everybody who's online here to type in
so the question that I would ask you, is anybody listening?
I assume so. How many people are there, as far as we know?
167.
167. Okay. So there are a couple questions, and another one's coming in. I have a couple questions for you. You're describing consciousness as a biological process, and so would you say that consciousness only occurs in living things?
Yes.
Okay.
Very simple. That's a very curt answer. No, but I think that consciousness, the way I defined it, I can see it occurring in living things and not in all living things. So, for example, I think when I mentioned unicellular organisms, for example, I would say that they are not, take a typical bacterium, I would say that it is not minded and it is not conscious. So there you have to make this. That's why I'm trying to make this important distinction between the things that show intelligent behavior versus the things that show intelligent behavior attached to a mind that is conscious. So bacteria have a remarkable intelligence. They have incredibly complex responses, including social responses, the ability to govern their numbers, for example, with quorum sensing, how they distribute themselves in environments that are conducive or not to their life. That's quite remarkable. But that doesn't mean that they have a mind. What they have is a well-oiled system to receive stimuli with their detectors and have the possibility of responding to their stimuli. The responses are intelligent because they are advantageous to the survival of the organism. So the best classification is that they are intelligent, but that doesn't mean that they were reasoned through. And that doesn't mean that bacterium is there pondering, looking inside her mind at what is going on and how it's going to respond. That is done automatically. What is interesting is that, of course, we have that form of responses too. We have plenty of automatic intelligent responses that come out of sensing and responding, and that do not require us to have a mind, and that do not require us, once you have our mind turned on, to reason through that mental process. So these are very, very distinct things. And unfortunately, very often they're confused. And I think they're confused because the more one studies unicellular organisms, the more it's obvious that these are absolutely remarkable creatures with enormous capabilities. When you think about even capabilities of socialization, of deciding whether or not to aggregate or to segregate, these are incredibly complex phenomena. But they can be done without a mind, even if they appear, for all intents and purposes, as they're coming out of a mind like ours. But they're not. And there's no evidence that they do. And when people say, well, where's the evidence that they don't? Well, of course, it's circumstantial evidence, but just show me in the body of a bacterium anything that would be capable, by whatever trick, would be capable of generating a pattern, generating a resemblance to something in the outside world, and generating what would be a reasoning flow where you would exclude something in favor of another. So you don't have those, you don't have any organelle that is going to give you that in a bacterium, or for that matter in a plant. Now, the plants are a very good example of creatures with great intelligence. The organization is different, of course. A lot of that intelligence is actually subterranean, but it's complex, and it gives you a lot of complex responses. There's something also that is very interesting here, and that has led people into confusion, is that if you apply, and this is back to Stuart Hameroff's territory of anesthesia, which is an absolutely fascinating field for anybody, for scientists and for neurologists, certainly. So here we have the fact that anesthetics are capable of freezing momentarily the life of a plant. The plant won't budge, won't do anything. The flow internally stops. The plant will not grow. The normal change, the response of leaves to light in the day cycle, that disappears. Anesthesia freezes it. So you could say, and the anesthetic froze the plant, therefore it stopped its consciousness, because if we give an anesthetic to a patient, the patient loses consciousness. Well, here we're playing with words, because what I think has happened, and by the way, anesthetics do the same thing to bacteria, so they just freeze in place. All you need to postulate is that the anesthetic suppresses the possibility of that organism responding to a stimulus. It suppresses the possibility of sensing, of detecting stimuli, and of course, because all of the remainder of the chain of the process into consciousness is based on that platform, you lose that platform, and the entire building collapses. You're not going to generate mental representations. You're not going to generate the kind of mental representations that are hybrid and correspond to feelings. And lo and behold, you're not going to have consciousness. But it is not because the anesthetic caused, by causing anesthesia, caused loss of consciousness. By causing anesthesia, it caused the collapse of a process that eventually, as others stack on top of it, is going to cause consciousness.
Okay, a lot of questions here, excellent ones. Here's one. Do you believe that conscious experience of internal feelings arose before conscious experience in response to external stimuli? And if so, is there any biological evidence to support this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And actually, it's a question that I briefly deal with in a new book about this topic, which is called Feeling and Knowing. And it's really a question about where exactly this came. And of course, we have no idea at the exact point at which this came. But actually, in my thinking about the problem and in conversations, for example, with a colleague of mine, Kingston Mann, we were talking, and I wrote something like, feeling occurs one step ahead of consciousness. And actually, Kingston read that sentence of mine and said, oh, maybe it's just a half step. And what we were really concerned with is the fact that once feeling begins to occur, it is very rapidly that it will, provided there's a structure in that organism, very rapidly it will confer ownership of that organism to that organism. Now, the trick here is the times at which this happened in evolution. So you probably had feeling occurring once you had a certain maturity of the nervous system, but let's not expect that it was our kind of nervous system. It was a simpler nervous system, and feeling was simply differentiated from outside perception. And here comes another problem, is how much of outside perception existed at that point. So you have all of these are questions that I think are approachable empirically if we really find the correct preparation to study and to ask these questions in terms of different specimen in evolution. But it's not an easy question. But in general, I would say that if I would have to choose, I would say that feeling and external perception probably emerged pretty much together. But it only started counting once feeling got the control of the process. And once it did, it actually helped the evolution of external perception, because now the external perception was being classified, qualified by feelings. And so there would be a possibility of weeding out things that are important from an evolutionary point of view and things that are not. Mm-hmm. And that's a very interesting question. Thank you very much.
Yeah. A lot of questions to choose from. Would you define consciousness and conscious processes as the same thing?
Consciousness and conscious processes. Well, yes and no. The two, of course, are very related. Conscious processes, if you have a coherent system, are going to be processes that use consciousness. But they're still different. A conscious process would be the process where consciousness has been applied to, and consciousness would be, of course, broader. But I would define consciousness as a trick, and it's a systems level trick that will allow you to gain from the knowledge that is emerging in the system. I think the term knowledge is actually very important. You know, consciousness through the ages has been lots and lots of things. But the more and more, to me, the key is knowledge. There's certain facts that are made clear by the process of consciousness. And that's why I think feeling and knowing are two pivotal processes which can contribute to this, to the making of conscious minds.
Okay. Here's one from Eric Andrews. If we take the idea of the interaction of feelings and image flow as consciousness, what differentiates the consciousness of a hamster and a human? Are they the same? If not, are we saying that the feeling of threat is fundamentally different between the hamster and human?
So I would say, since we're going to do humans and hamsters, I would say they're the same. I perfectly expect, I don't think consciousness is a human prerogative. I think that a very large number of other living creatures are conscious, but the differences are not in the consciousness per se. I think the differences are in consequences of being conscious that are reflected in the remainder of the cognitive processes. So it's quite possible, one could argue, and by the way, I haven't thought about that problem recently to give you an informed answer, but one could argue that consciousness is all the same, that once you have this trick of referring mental processes to your organism, you're over and done with. So what changes after that is the scope of the mind. And by the way, I used to, as you know, I've written about this topic, and one of the good things, one of the good advantages of sort of being alive for a while is that you get to see your own mistakes, and you get to see where you did not do as well as you should have, or you get to see things that you have changed your opinion about. So, for example, I used to talk I think the first time that I connected consciousness with feeling was actually when I wrote a book, which still is one of my favorite books, and it's called The Feeling of What Happens. And the title is a poetic title, actually. It's inspired by a verse in a poem. But of course, it's much more than poetic, because I thought then that feeling was going to be the key. I just didn't have all the details that I do today to argue that that's indeed the case. And I may still be arguing wrong, but nonetheless, I'm more convinced of it today than I was in the year 2000, which is when I wrote The Feeling of What Happens. Now, where was I going with The Feeling of What Happens? Yes, in The Feeling of What Happens, there is one concept that I was very fond of, and that's the concept of extended consciousness. And so what I thought is that, well, there's a little sort of small scale consciousness that gives you the moment, but then there's this vast process that is all illuminated by consciousness, and that is extended consciousness. So if you're thinking about how you apprehend Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, you bet you need extended consciousness, because you need to encompass all of that incredible compass of poetry and music, and the same thing if you're dealing with another piece of music, or with say, Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu. Fine, except that I don't think you need an extended consciousness. What you need is an extended mind. You need a process of mind, and that's where you have the very big separation between the hamster and the human. So even if all of these creatures are conscious in the sense that they are assuming a perspective from their organism that guides their behavior, and that makes their behavior much more precise and valuable and efficacious for their survival. Even if that permeates all of these living structures, we have this huge compass of knowledge, of memory, to boot enriched by language, and that extended mind, whenever we use knowledge that is in the extended mind, we can make that conscious if it connects with ourselves. So you don't need an extended consciousness for anything. What you need is an extended mind, and you need the process of consciousness that might be extremely similar in its basic design in the hamster and in myself, and in many other creatures. Like, for example, if you go to social insects, I would be very surprised if social insects are not going to be considered conscious. I think they are, and I think a lot of things they do. That's why a small part of the insect population happens to be social, in the way that wasps and ants are, and that's because there's something very particular about their operation, and their operation, I think, requires a modicum of consciousness. So it may be as far down as that small part of the insect world. So it's very, very expanded, but it doesn't mean that the insects have minds the way we do. I think that that's not the case.
There's so many great questions. I'll just pick one here.
Good.
Can you elaborate on the implications of interoception being transmitted through unmyelinated pathways? What effect that has on the ability to articulate these perceptions? Would the leakiness relate to how difficult it is to symbolize this experience into language?
So I think there, what I would emphasize is this dramatic distinction in the hardware for these two levels of perception. And clearly that the hardware we have neurally, biologically, for the perceptions of the outside world is super refined. And I think that when you think, and it's very interesting that we learned a lot about what it is to perceive and to generate, for example, maps of the world within or without. We got to know about them through actually the most refined level of physiology, which is the visual physiology. And that precisely because you have these very dramatic patterns in vision, we have the possibility of studying the maps in, say, the visual cortices in Area 17, as David Jubel and Torsten Wiesel did, and that was a very serious revelation to how the whole thing works. And of course, the same thing happens in the auditory world. In the world that ends up in brainstem nuclei and ends up ultimately at the level of the insula and cingulate, it's very different because precision is not at a premium. So if you are perceiving the outside world and the map you make puts you gives you the idea that something is in this point, but in fact it's a couple of centimeters away, you can be cooked. That mistake you pay dearly for at whatever level of the phylogenetic scale you are. Whereas when you're creating patterns for what's going on in your gut, for example, or your stomach, or what's going on in terms of the aperture of smooth vessels in the skin, which is, of course, incredibly important because it gives you, what you end up having as, say, systemic blood pressure is related to that. What you have in terms of feeling cold and comfortable, or cold and uncomfortable, or warm and comfortable, is dependent on that. But it does not have to be a perfect rigor. You do not have to measure that mentally as if you were using a thermometer. You have a playing slack, and I think that slack exactly came out. Let's say it was good that we started that way, because if we did not have those leaky processes that we have in fibers that don't have myelin, we would be in much greater trouble. But just think that one of the main trunks of information, nervous trunks of information, from the body to the central nervous system is actually the vagus nerve. And I think the vagus nerve was not called vague because of this, but 80 to 90% of the fibers of the vagus nerve are not myelinated. And of course, what that means is that you have a palisade of axons that are next to each other, and instead of the current going only through that particular path into a destination, that current can actually leak sideways. And you can have actually contacts of fibers with other fibers, and instead of synapses, you get ephapses. So there is a certain amount of vagueness there, but the value that it gives us is all of this wealth of information that we call feeling and that we appreciate so much.
Yeah. 1 minute left. I'll squeeze in one more. To what extent does cultural conditioning and indoctrination influence feelings?
I think the very good question. The answer is enormously. I think that well, I don't think it influences the feelings of the puppy dog or the feelings of the bird flying around, but it influences ours, because a lot of the basic feelings are what they are. And if they weren't, we wouldn't have the possibility that we have of communicating with human beings in other cultures and understanding our faces and so forth, which we do. But let's be careful. We do, but we also can make mistakes. And when you look at the facial expressions of different cultures, you realize that sometimes they can mean things different in here or in the city, across the world. So I think that culture has an enormous influence in shaping the detail. It doesn't shape the basics. Let me give you another probably better example. Suppose you try to block airflow by blocking, by either having, say, an attack of asthma or blocking the airway. And when you block the airway, you very rapidly end up with a fundamental primordial emotion called air hunger. Now that, I suspect, is equal here or anywhere in the world. So there are certain things that are basic because they are homeostatically related. They are homeostatic feelings and emotions. They're not the feeling of fear or rage or love and joy that we have. Those are constructed emotions that have a lot to do with our culture, and we rate, for example, fear or rage differently if we are here or if we are in another part of town. But things like air hunger, for example, that is something that is perfectly universal, and which of course you can also see in creatures that are not human. So you have, I think it's a very good question. You just have to plot it and you see that there's a huge distribution.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you so much. It was really excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that it was still possible for some people to listen to it in spite of the stress.
150. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good to see you.
Okay.